Picture a German infantry commander in the summer of 1944, crouched in a fortified position somewhere in the Bocage country of Normandy, trying to calculate his next move. He has spent years reading the battlefield the way a chess grandmaster reads the board. He knows the British. He understands their rhythms. He can predict their next 3 moves before they make the first one. But the Americans are something his training never prepared him for. They don't play chess. They flip the board, scatter the pieces, and start throwing punches. And somehow, with that approach, they are winning. This isn't a story about who was braver. The British soldier was formidably brave. The German Wehrmacht was arguably the most technically proficient military force in modern history. Now, this is a story about something more unsettling. How a nation that had been at peace for over 2 decades produced a fighting force that veteran German commanders would privately describe as the most dangerous enemy they ever faced. Not the most disciplined, not the most refined, the most dangerous. And to understand why, you have to start not with American strength, but with German expectations. To a battle-hardened veteran of the German Wehrmacht, war was a professional science. It had doctrines, rhythms, and unspoken agreements between opposing professionals. When German units faced the British through North Africa and into Italy, there was a grim familiarity to the contest. The British were disciplined, methodical, and rigidly bound by the chain of command. They moved when authorized to move. They waited for artillery confirmation. They rarely improvised at the squad level. To the German professional, this was comprehensible. You could plan against it. Then, in late 1942 and into 1943, the Americans arrived, and within weeks, the classified intelligence reports of the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service, began filling with language that German officers rarely used about any enemy. Words like unpredictable, irrational, dangerous in the way that a fire is dangerous. Not because it is intelligent, but because it does not recognize boundaries. The first and most immediately disorienting thing about the American GEO was what happened when you ambushed him. In virtually every established military doctrine of the era, troops under surprise fire were trained to seek cover, consolidate, assess, and await orders. The Germans did this. The British did this. It was logical. It was professional. American squads did the opposite. When ambushed, they charged, reflexively, instinctively, sometimes suicidally, straight toward the source of fire. No consolidated assessment. No waiting for orders. Forward. German officers documented this pattern with a mixture of tactical frustration and something approaching reluctant respect. A famous observation circulating among Wehrmacht commanders was that you could not predict the Americans because they did not know what they were going to do themselves. That was not an insult. That was a threat assessment. If you like what this channel does, pulling apart the mechanics of what actually happened beneath the official history and telling you why it matters, hit the like button now. Because this is exactly what we're here for. This instinctive aggression was amplified by a volume of fire that bordered on the industrial. During the Normandy campaign, an American infantry division was capable of generating roughly 12,000 rounds of small arms, fire per minute of active engagement, nearly 3 times the rate of their British counterparts. The Germans were not just fighting more aggressive men, they were fighting a different philosophy of violence entirely, one that did not believe in economy of force when overwhelming force was available. Data compiled by Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall reinforced what German commanders were experiencing in real time. While traditional European armies saw only 15 to 25% of soldiers actively firing their weapons in a given engagement, American units maintained something closer to total squad participation. Every man firing, every man forward, no hesitation waiting for the professional assessment from above. To the German defender, this was not just a tactical problem. It was a psychological one. You could not model it, you could not predict it. And in warfare, the unknown is always more frightening than the understood. In the established military thinking of the 1940s, an officer was not just a leader. He was the central processor of his unit. Destroy the officer, and you did not just remove one man. You removed the decision-making capacity of an entire platoon. The British operated this way. The Germans operated this way. Kill the lieutenant, and the unit hesitates. It reorganizes. It waits. American units did not wait. And this was one of the most strategically consequential cultural features of the American military, and German after-action reports returned to it constantly. Killing an American lieutenant did not stop the attack. It simply changed who was leading it. The corporal stepped up, then the private, then whoever was closest to the front and still moving. The attack continued. This was not an accident of bravery. It was a cultural artifact. American soldiers came from a society that did not have a centuries-old class structure governing who was qualified to make decisions. In the American military's conception of itself, every soldier was a potential problem solver. You were not a cog waiting to be directed. You were a self-governing unit expected to exercise judgment. The most legendary illustration of this bottom-up improvisation did not happen at the strategic level. It happened in a muddy Norman field, courtesy of a sergeant named Curtis Cullen. The hedgerows of Normandy, the bocage, were stopping American armor cold. Ancient earthen walls, sometimes 10 feet thick, impenetrable to the Sherman tank's approach. Cullen did not wait for a directive from high command. He welded steel teeth salvaged from German beach obstacles to the front of a Sherman and drove it straight through the wall. Within 11 days, the U.S. Army had fitted approximately 500 tanks with these Rhino devices, roughly 60% of the First Army's entire armored force, based on one sergeant's field improvisation. German commanders found this autonomy genuinely unsettling. Their after-action reports noted that even when American units were cut off and surrounded, 50% of their command structure destroyed, small groups averaging 12 men continued to fight at full effectiveness. In German military logic, this should not have been possible. The formula was simple. Decapitate the command structure, and the body stops functioning. Against the Americans, the formula did not hold. Save this video. What we're building here, the framework for understanding why certain military forces operate the way they do. This is something you'll want to come back to. The psychology underneath these tactical patterns has implications that run a lot deeper than World War II. By 1944, American small unit commanders had been granted up to 40% more operational latitude than their British equivalents. It was not just that individual Americans were more aggressive. The system itself was engineered to push decision-making downward to the lowest possible level as a matter of deliberate doctrine. To the Germans, fighting the British was like breaking a chain. Find the weak link, apply pressure. Fighting the Americans was like fighting smoke. There was no single point of failure to target. For the veteran commanders of the Africa Corps, the first serious encounter with American forces felt, frankly, like confirmation of everything they had assumed. At Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, the Americans were exactly what the Germans expected: green, tactically clumsy, and badly led. Over 6,000 American casualties, nearly 200 tanks lost in a single engagement. It was a decisive German victory, and Wehrmacht intelligence assumed the American force would be operationally sidelined for months, possibly the rest of the campaign. What happened instead became one of the most alarming data points of the entire war for German high command. The Americans did not collapse. They did not retreat into a prolonged period of institutional mourning and doctrinal reassessment. They treated the disaster as a laboratory. Within 30 days of the Kasserine defeat, the U.S. Army had overhauled its command structure at the theater level, fully integrated air support with ground units for the first time, and retrained its tank crews in close-range engagement tactics specifically designed to handle German panzers. When German units faced those same American forces weeks later in Tunisia, they were not fighting the same army. Tactical efficiency had improved by an estimated 25% in a single month. This is the part that should stop you for a moment, because it reveals something that goes well beyond military history. Most institutions, most human systems, treat failure as something to be absorbed and moved past. The American military in World War II treated failure as raw material. Every battlefield defeat was immediately processed, documented, analyzed, and converted into updated doctrine. This was not a cultural accident. It was institutional infrastructure. The U.S. Army updated over 150 different field manuals in 1944 alone, specific techniques for neutralizing the MG-42 machine gun, methods for bypassing Dragon's Tooth fortifications, procedures learned from engagements that had occurred weeks earlier, already printed and distributed to replacement troops arriving at the front. A fresh, American infantrymen landing in France in late 1944 often carried more current tactical knowledge than a German veteran who had been in continuous combat for 2 years, simply because the Germans' training was based on doctrine from 1939 and the Americans' was based on what had actually worked last month. To the German military, this created a strategic nightmare with no solution. By the time a countermeasure was developed for an American tactic, the Americans had already discarded that tactic for something newer. The Germans were, in a very real sense, one always fighting the last version of the enemy, and the enemy kept releasing updates. The logistical infrastructure that enabled this adaptation was equally staggering. After losing nearly 200 tanks at Kasserine, American replacement vehicles arrived within days. A German division suffering comparable losses would have been combat ineffective for months. The Americans were not just learning faster, they were absorbing losses faster, which meant they could afford to experiment in ways that the Wehrmacht, operating under constant material constraint, simply could not. This channel exists for exactly the kind of viewer who wants to understand the mechanisms underneath the surface history. Not just what happened, but why it happened and what it reveals about how organizations and systems actually function under pressure. If that's the level you want to operate at, subscribe now, because we've only just started pulling at this thread. By the Sicily invasion in the summer of 1943, American fire coordination had advanced to the point where artillery was landing within 100 yards of their own advancing troops, a margin of precision and nerve that veteran German units found operationally suicidal. The bumbling amateurs of Kasserine had become something else entirely. To German intelligence, the Americans were not improving, they were evolving, and they were doing it faster than any countermeasure could be designed. There is a point in this history where the tactical story becomes something larger, a collision between two fundamentally incompatible philosophies of what war actually is. To the German professional soldier, war was a craft. It rewarded skill, discipline, tactical ingenuity, and the warrior's ability to outthink an opponent under pressure. The German Wehrmacht at its peak was arguably the finest expression of that philosophy in modern military history. These were professionals in the deepest sense of the word, men who had elevated the conduct of war to something approaching an art form. The Americans looked at all of that and essentially said, "We respect it, and we are going to bury it under steel." American doctrine, by 1944, had arrived at a brutally simple operating principle. Where there is resistance, you do not outmaneuver it with clever infantry plays. You erase it with high explosives, and then you advance through the debris. This was not a failure of imagination. It was a deliberate choice, a rational calculation that inanimate material was worth far more than irreplaceable human lives. Trade shells for soldiers. Every time. Without sentiment. The numbers behind this philosophy were almost incomprehensible in scale. During the push across Western Europe, American forces expended an average of 5 to 6 tons of ammunition for every single German soldier killed or captured. The German army, crippled by supply shortages, was often rationing artillery shells to 10 or 15 rounds per gun per day. American batteries operated with no such ceiling. The sheer weight of steel coming down on German positions rendered tactical brilliance functionally irrelevant. You cannot outmaneuver a time-on-target artillery strike. You can only survive it or not. The time-on-target technique deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most psychologically devastating innovations in the entire war. American Fire Direction Center officers used synchronized watches and complex calculations to stagger the firing sequences of guns from 10 or 12 different battalions, sometimes 144 individual heavy weapons scattered miles apart, so that every shell arrived at the same coordinate within a window of 3 seconds. No warning whistle, no ranging shots that gave defenders time to dive into bunkers. Just silence, and then the world ending all at once. German survivors described the experience consistently, the automatic, omnipresent nature of it. A single German machine gun squad opens fire. Within 5 minutes, a forward observer has called in a barrage. There was no safe choice to make. Fire and invite destruction, stay silent and cede the ground. During the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery units fired 1,200,000 shells in 14 days. German prisoners taken in that period reported that 75% of their casualties had been caused by artillery before they ever made visual contact with an American soldier. Here is the single sharpest insight this history offers, and it is one that most military analysis misses entirely. The German Wehrmacht lost not because it lacked courage, tactical genius, or professional excellence. It lost because it was optimized for a version of war that the Americans simply refused to fight. The Americans changed the game. They made technical mastery irrelevant by raising the material cost of the contest to a level no amount of skill could offset. Genius cannot survive being buried under 6 tons of ammunition per man, and that, more than any individual battle or campaign, is the story of why the war ended the way it did. If you just felt that land, and you're already thinking about who in your life needs to watch this, share it with them now. The person who thinks they know this history because they've seen the films and read the summaries. Because what we're talking about here is something the standard account almost never addresses directly. To a German soldier in Normandy in the summer of 1944, the sound of an aircraft engine did not mean danger. It meant death was already in progress. The Germans had a word for the American fighter bomber, Jabo, and they had a phrase for the experience of facing them, Jabo Todd, death from above. It was not metaphorical. It was a clinical description. The British Royal Air Force conducted its air campaign largely at altitude and primarily at night. Massive strategic bombing raids against German industrial and urban centers. Devastating, unquestionably, but operating at a remove from the immediate battlefield. The Americans brought the aircraft down to the dirt. They specialized in tactical air support, low-altitude armed reconnaissance, and the systematic hunting of anything that moved on a French road between dawn and dusk. The primary instrument of this was the P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of aircraft carrying .850 caliber machine guns and thousands of pounds of ordnance. And American pilots flew it not in structured formations responding to pre-planned targets, but in roving, armed patrols. They were looking for opportunity. They found it constantly. By the summer of 1944, U.S. tactical air commands were conducting over 1,000 sorties per day across the Normandy theater. The operational consequence for German armored units was absolute. Elite panzer divisions, the formations that had conquered Western Europe in 40 days in 1940, became nocturnal. They could only move in darkness, averaging 10 to 15 kilometers of progress per night. A single American scout plane spotting an exhaust plume in the tree line could summon a strike package within minutes. Statistical records from the Normandy campaign show that 70% of German tank losses during certain retreat phases were caused not by American armor but by air-to-ground rockets and strafing runs. The British were a threat on the front line. The Americans were a threat every second the sun was above the horizon. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. There is something worth watching next that connects directly to what we're examining here. How the Americans continued developing this doctrine of overwhelming material superiority into the post-war period, and what happened when they first encountered an enemy who refused to be buried by it. That video addresses a question this one can only point at. What happens when material dominance meets an enemy with nothing left to lose? It is a different kind of lesson, and it complicates everything we've just established. Here is what broke the German soldiers' will to fight in the end. Not a battle, a sandwich. By 1944, the German army was moving on horses. 70% of Wehrmacht transport still relied on animal power. Soldiers were subsisting on frozen rations, sometimes scraping for potatoes in abandoned fields. Supply chains had broken down to the point where artillery units were counting individual shells. American logistics operated in a different universe entirely. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system of over 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies to American frontline units every single day. Every single day! The scale of it was not just operationally decisive, it was psychologically annihilating. German prisoners captured in the final year of the war reported a consistent experience. At some point, they encountered American logistics, and something inside them gave way. Not because the Americans were cruel, because the Americans were eating hot turkey dinners in a freezing forest. Because American privates had fresh socks and cigarettes and chocolate. Because, and this detail from a captured German officer passed through Wehrmacht intelligence circles and never really left, a shipment of fresh cream-filled birthday cakes had been transported from the United States to soldiers on active frontline service. Birthday cakes. To a man rationing artillery shells and marching on worn-through boots, this was not just abundance. This was a message. You are fighting an economy, not an army. and economies do not run out. For every tank the German war industry struggled to produce in the final year of the war, American factories were delivering nearly 4. American armor operated on high-octane gasoline available in quantities 10 times greater than the entire German Reich could produce. Replacement parts, recovery vehicles, specialized fuel, trained mechanics. The infrastructure that kept 90% of the American fleet operational at all times, while German panzer units cannibalized disabled vehicles for components. The average American infantryman in late 1944 was carrying 88 pounds of equipment, including tools and manuals, incorporating tactical lessons learned just 3 months prior. German training programs, gutted by manpower shortages, had shrunk from 16 weeks to as few as 4, producing soldiers fighting with doctrine from 1939 against an enemy running on doctrine from last Thursday. Facing the British was a battle between professional traditions. Facing the Americans was being fed into a machine that did not acknowledge the concept of limitation. What do you think was the single factor that hit the German military hardest? The material dominance, the tactical adaptability, or the psychological impact of American aggression and logistics? Write it out in the comments. Not just an answer, the reasoning behind it, because other people reading this thread are going to encounter your argument, and it is going to make the history land differently for them than it did before. There is a question this history raises that it cannot answer within its own boundaries. The Americans won, in large part, by being willing to fight a kind of war that their enemies were not philosophically prepared to fight. They substituted industrial weight for tactical elegance. They replaced hierarchy with autonomy. They treated defeat as data. They made the sky into a weapon and the supply chain into a psychological instrument. Every one of those decisions made sense in the context of a total industrial war against a geographically contained enemy with a finite resource base. What this history cannot tell you, what would require an entirely separate and more uncomfortable conversation, is what happens when that doctrine encounters a conflict where industrial superiority does not translate into the outcomes it should, where the enemy does not behave like a resource that can be exhausted, where winning every tactical engagement still somehow fails to win the war. That question is still being asked, and it has not been answered yet.